Okay, I think we'll get started. There might be a few people still coming in over the next minute or so, but first of all, thanks for joining, everybody. If you could just take your seat, we'll get started in a minute. There's some seats in the back. Please help yourself. The challenge with telling a joke on a webinar is there's obviously no feedback, no smiles, no laughs. There's a whole lot of dead air, so there's really no good outcome. Every joke hits a brick wall. So we're going to do our best to limit those as best we can over the next 45 minutes or so. Okay, my name is Pete Davies. I've been with Colliers for 18 years now. I'm the co-chair of Colliers Not-for-Profit Advisory Group. Matt and I are excited to host today, and we're going to summarize the results from over 100 survey responses that we received from executive directors and other senior leaders on how various nonprofits and charities are faring within this pandemic situation. We believe benchmarking data can be really helpful when making strategic decisions for your organization. So hopefully you find it useful. Our team's focus is helping nonprofits and charities with everything related to their office space and real estate. Our clients vary across the nonprofit and charity spectrum, and we have a lot of these organizations with us here today, which is amazing. Joining us are leaders from different sectors, including associations, foundations, affordable housing, seniors housing, social services, education, health providers, institutions, and also various places of worship. Now, over the past few years, we've been asked to speak and present at various seminars and conferences, including CPA Canada's annual nonprofit conference, Bloomberg's Charity Law Seminar, and we've co-hosted events with RBC's exclusive nonprofit team. However, this is our first webinar. We're also thrilled that Cathy Taylor, the Executive Director of the Ontario Nonprofit Network, is able to join us. And Cathy's going to share the results from ONN's COVID-19 survey that was answered by almost 500 nonprofit organizations. So I'm going to turn it over to Matt to briefly introduce himself, the purpose of the survey, and today's agenda. Matt?
Thank you, Pete. And I know you can't see the audience, but I, for one, will say that I did find that opening of yours to be quite humorous. I'm not sure it was a joke, but either way, thank you.
Wasn't planned, yeah.
Yeah, you put a smile on my face. Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. We hope you're all healthy and safe. And welcome to our webinar. My name, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Matt Johnson. I'm Senior Vice President of Colliers International, where I have been for 20 years. And with Pete, I am co-chair of our not-for-profit advisory group providing service across the country. The purpose of this afternoon is to understand the impact of COVID-19 on the nonprofit and charitable sector. What we will do is we will walk you through common working from home amusements, respondent data, funding and operations and finances. Cathy will share highlights of the ONN survey. We will explore future office changes that we're forecasting, work from home challenges, landlord support, and then we'll end with quotes and themes on COVID-19's lasting impact. Of course, all of this information is from information provided to us by yourselves. Thank you for that. Also, please note that there is a chat bar, and if you wish to ask questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat. We will do our best to answer questions at the end, time permitting, and if we don't, we will make sure to answer them outside of this venue this afternoon.
Okay, so before we dive right into the responses from the survey, we thought we would take a few minutes and show you a few slides with a few fun anecdotes and visuals. Now, like many of yourselves, we are also working remotely from home. We are struggling with IT issues sometimes. We're having numerous video calls. We're jockeying for space and internet time with family. And we have experienced many of the same phrases, expressions, distractions, and visuals that many of you have. And in addition to overused words such as unprecedented and extraordinary, we thought we'd share a few commonly used sayings with you before getting started. Some of these phrases and questions are, can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me now? I think you're on mute. You're still on mute. Why isn't this thing working? And that's quite the beard you have going there. Expressions and sounds, kids and family interruptions. The clip on the left is an abbreviated clip of a reporter on live TV getting blindsided by his kids. And then finally, working from home. Every day often feels like Groundhog Day. Now, visuals, some very unappealing impersonations, including The Edge. We'll try not to show that one again, don't worry. And finally, an image that is very hard to forget and forever tied to this pandemic, the Tiger King. Hopefully, most of you have not necessarily seen this, but hopefully most of you know what this is. Matt?
Thank you, Pete. So we wanted to start by setting the stage, so to speak, and providing you with information so we all understand where this information of our survey is coming from. We are quite pleased to have a broad overview of responses from different organizations of different size. Half of our responses were from organizations of less than 10 people. Quarter were with people of between 10 and 49. And then a further 25% of responses came from organizations that have a staff count of in excess of 50, the majority of which was in fact in excess of 100. We asked organizations to describe themselves, and similarly to the previous slide, the responses came from a broad reach of organizational profiles. When analyzing the total, about 70% of information was through the lens of traditional nonprofit and charitable organizations, with about 30% coming from organizations defining themselves as religious organizations. Again, we are pleased to see the breadth of reach across so many sectors that contributed to our data set. We then asked organizations to discuss the annual operating budget that they have, and this slide demonstrates a similar pattern to our first slide. Approximately 40% of organizations identified budgets of less than 1 million. Approximately 30% have budgets between 1 and 5 million. And then a further 30% of organizations that provided us with responses have budgets greater than 5 million, with about 1 in 5 having budgets in excess of 10 million on an annual basis. It was also important to us that our responses were provided by individuals in positions of influence and leadership, which our data validates. 58% of our responses came from executive directors and CEOs. A further 12% came from individuals within finance, most of which were of a CFO or similar position. And then a further 10% identified as operations, 10% as administration, and then another category of 10%, which we believe was mainly pastors and other religious leaders. Pete?
Okay, so getting into the survey a bit, we asked some questions about funding and operations. And the first real question we asked was, has your nonprofit or charity remained operational since the start of COVID-19? 49% said they were still open and operating. Another 40% said they were still open and operating, but with notably reduced services and operations. Unfortunately, 11% have had to cease all operations temporarily. But the good news is that none of our respondents have had permanent closures. We also asked, for those organizations that remain operational, as things stand today, how long can you sustain your operations? And the good news is that 70% were confident that they will remain operational both during and after the pandemic. But 20% are only able to sustain operations for 6 to 12 months. And then another 10% were only able to sustain their operations for 1 to 6 months. So, not surprisingly, the length of their overall market shutdown, it's obviously a huge factor for the viability of many nonprofits and charities. And results vary because the timing of the revenue can be widespread. For example, some nonprofits may be heavily reliant upon their summer golf tournament fundraiser. Now, assuming that this is canceled, some smaller organizations are telling us that they might not be able to survive until next year, unfortunately. We asked, what are the primary impacts to your organization from COVID-19? And multiple answers were accepted for this one. Somewhat surprising to us is that work from home challenges came out on top at 76%. Reduced revenue was second, as mentioned by 3/4 of the respondents. 61% noted client service disruption. Almost half said that they have depleting financial reserves. Almost half said that they have an increased demand for their services. 39% noted the community they serve was inaccessible. So we suspect, this could be some within social services and certainly many religious organizations. Almost a third told us that they have staff reductions. 1/4 noted that the services that they receive from their partners are being disrupted. And then finally, 1/4 are experiencing both employee, and volunteer absenteeism. So, to us, it's not surprising that reduced revenues and depleting financial reserves are both high in this list. But it is a little bit surprising how high work from home challenges are after 7 weeks of working from home. And we think it's also interesting and probably worth repeating that while 3/4 of the respondents currently have reduced funding, almost half also have an increased demand for their services, which obviously causes even more challenges for these organizations. Now, there have been some exceptions to the reduced funding model, though. Organizations such as food banks have seen donations increase, along with an increase in demand for their services. Matt?
Thank you, Pete. When asked to estimate the total financial impact of COVID-19 upon their organization, we saw that 11% expect to see less than 5% impact. And when paired with the 29% that are forecasting a financial impact to the negative in the range of 5 to 20%, this results in an aggregate of 4 in 10, 2 in 5 of responses forecasting an impact of 20% or less. Obviously, this is not positive news, but the flip side of these results shows that 6 in 10, 60% are forecasting an impact of greater than 20% in the reduction in funding, with nearly 30% of organizations anticipating to see a 50% or greater reduction in funding. This does provide great insight into just how hard so many important organizations are expecting to feel the impact of COVID-19. 3 in 10 are forecasting to have their annual funding cut by at least half. With the reduction in funding, we are not surprised to see a similar view on programs, services, and operations. 11% of responses expect to realize a 5% or less adjustment, which mirrors the previous slide. A further 20% forecast to be as much of 20% adjustment to their programs, services, and operations, which again mirrors what we just saw, as about 40% of organizations are seeing the impact to be a reduction in programs, services, and operations to be about 20% or less, which means that 60% of organizations are indicating that they anticipate to see a minimum of a 20% impact on their ability to deliver programs, services, and operations. And 20% of responses are forecasting to see their programs, services, and operations to be cut in at least half. And in times like these, when community needs are escalating, these responses paint a very concerning picture regarding the ability to reach those most in need. When asked to identify those resources that could be most beneficial at this time, not surprising, we saw government lead the way here at 74%, followed by donors at 52% and foundations at 48%. It's going to be interesting to track the effect of COVID-19 on the donor base, as well as the capacities of foundations going forward. Landlords were identified by 26% of responses, which we will address a little bit later. And 20% of responses identified corporations and volunteers while 15% identified their banks and financial institutions. I'm now going to invite Cathy Taylor, Executive Director of Ontario Nonprofit Network, to share highlights of ONN's recent survey.
Hi everyone. Hope you're doing well during these times. It's a pleasure to join you today from Erin, Ontario, and hope you're all doing well where you are. So the Ontario Nonprofit Network is a network of thousands of nonprofits and charities in Ontario. If you take a look at this slide, it shows that there's 58,000 nonprofits and charities in Ontario. 1 million people employed by our sector, and 80% of those are women, which makes our sector somewhat unique as well. We contribute $50 in economic impact and engage 5 million volunteers in addition to those 1 million staff members. So this is a bit of a snapshot of the sector that's impacted by COVID-19. And I'll ask for the next slide, please. So ONN is our job is to advocate for and by the sector, specifically to the provincial government, but also to federal governments and other entities, and to support nonprofits and charities where they are right now and to help them be successful for the future. Next slide. So of course, we were very interested and worried about the state of the nonprofit sector in Ontario and the impacts of COVID-19 on the work that we do. We did a survey. This one was in late March, so early on in the current pandemic crisis. And we surveyed in depth 500 organizations that represented a number of types of organizations across the nonprofit sector. And what we really learned was that organizations were facing a triple threat. So a reduction in funding, whether that was fee for services, earned income, fundraising events, partnership dollars, so a big reduction in funding, HR challenges, so both shortages, ironically, shortages in human resources for people to do the work, as well as laying staff off, transition to work from home, transition to virtual offerings, and then of course, just the health and safety of their clients and the people that they serve, as well as their own staff. So in facing these threats, what we learned from this particular survey was that 75% had already, and this was about 3 or 4 weeks into the crisis, had reduced fundraising revenues from 75%. And that's anticipated to go much, much higher throughout this year. One in 5 organizations by that time had already closed their doors and unsure if they would reopen or not. Some temporary, but some were unclear if their doors would open again in the future. And at that point, over a third of the sector had already laid off staff. Now, this was before the federal programs that have been rolled out, such as the wage subsidy program, but we know that many in our sector aren't eligible for that program. And we know that Imagine Canada also did a survey of charities across Canada that was released this week. And the numbers are quite similar. So about 30% of our sector has laid off staff, which is thousands and thousands of workers in the nonprofit sector. Next slide, please. So we particularly looked at sorry, you had already switched that. Thanks, Vena. We particularly looked at 3 or 4 sectors. So the health sector, the education sector, the arts sector, and social services to see how they were doing. So for example, in the education and research nonprofits that existed, half of them are laying staff off. And more than a third can only sustain their organization, only 1/3 can sustain their organizations for 1 or 2 months as a result of this crisis. And a quarter of them have experienced closure. So they were dramatically affected by COVID-19. Next slide, please. The arts and culture sector in a very different spot. 80% of their revenue has gone down, and that's primarily because, as one might suspect, they earn revenue through fee-for-service, ticket sales, event sales, people coming to art galleries and theaters and festivals, as well as sponsorships and fundraising dollars. 2/5 of those organizations had their doors closed until further notice. And about 1/3 remain open with changes to their current programs or services. And they for sure are feeling like they will be financially doomed if funds aren't available to help them get through this crisis. Next slide, please. And in terms of health nonprofits, obviously in a different spot, most of them are open, but 83% have experienced a disruption in their services, of course, because they're, maybe open, but maybe they're not able to serve clients in the same way, or their communities in the same way as they have before. They anticipate in this sector that the impact of them, the financial impact, just over a 3-month closure period, is between $100,000 and $500,000. And if you multiply that by the number of organizations, that's a significant gap. 75% have seen reduced revenues already, and they can sustain themselves a little longer than some of the other sectors, but still no more than 3 to 6 months. So a really difficult time for that subsector as well. Next slide, please. And finally, our social service nonprofits, they have had almost 3/4 of their revenue reduced from fundraising, which is similar to other folks. They have less reserves, typically social services, than other sectors, so can only sustain their organizations for 1 to 2 months, about a fifth of them. And over 90% have experienced some disruption to their clients and to their communities. Many social service organizations are operating as first responders and essential services in these times, but not quite deemed to be first responders or essential services in many of the supports that are available to them. Thank you. Next slide, please. So what does this tell us? So first of all these detailed survey results are on our website, so you can take a look, share widely by subsector as well as geography. So what we're doing as a result is we have a COVID-19 resources page where we're updating policy updates and an analysis from the provincial and federal governments all the time. In fact, every day we update our website so you can see what governments are saying and how they impact the sector. We're creating resources, curating and creating new ones, such as a virtual AGM toolkit. We're right now collecting some HR resources that will be helpful to the sector in the transition. We're also doing weekly webinars with subject matter experts. So we've had a couple with an HR lawyer. We have a series now with a financial management expert, and there's more to come in that respect. And certainly we're spending a lot of our time advocating to funders and government for more effective funding for the sector, more flexible and stable funding for the sector to make sure that we come out the other side of this. And just finally, next slide, please. In terms of our advocacy to the provincial government, based on those survey results and everything that you're telling us, that the sector is telling us, here are the top 6 things that we're working on right now. We're an emergency stabilization fund for the nonprofit sector, both federally and provincially. We have a proposal into the Ontario government for a $680 million stabilization fund. That proposal is on our website, and we encourage you to share that and talk to your MPPs about it. Flexibility in funding agreements, so both for foundations and funders, to encourage them to be more flexible with this year's funding agreements that might be in place. And then some broader advocacy around paid sick leave and its importance to workers, but workers in our sector as well. Access to personal protective equipment for those nonprofits and charities that are open and are serving the public. Access to emergency childcare, and we've got some wins on that, although there's not quite enough spaces yet available for childcare. And finally, making sure that nonprofits and charities are part of the recovery planning for the economy and for the services that Ontarians count on. So I'll just leave you with, all of our information is available, of course, on our website, and you can connect with us as well on Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn. But I'm very happy to take your questions at the end of today's webinar, and also you can contact us at any time to share your story or share your suggestions for the work that we're doing. Thanks.
Great. Cathy, thanks very much for that. We really appreciate you joining us today. What we'd like to do now is review a few responses back to our survey and with themes about office space, work from home issues, and landlord support. So one of the questions we asked was, going forward, what physical changes to your office space are you most likely to make? 40% said they will likely have a decreased space requirement due to work from home flexibility. 30% said they will likely have a decreased space requirement due to work from home flexibility. 20% said they will likely have a decreased space requirement due to work from home flexibility. 30% said they will likely have a decreased space requirement due to work from home flexibility. 1/4 said that they're likely to have an increased space due to social distancing requirements and or their preferences. 20% said they expressed a preference for sharing space with other nonprofits. So, one question from that is, will we see an increase in nonprofit hubs like CSI or Foundation House, where Cathy at ONN is situated? Finally, 14% noted that they expect a decreased need for space due to lower funding. So, to us, this is really interesting, and this uncertainty of how your workspace should or will look going forward, it's very common amongst both nonprofits, charities, but also with for-profit organizations. In the comments section to this question, another 15% noted no changes are expected. And then several others just said it's just too early to tell right now. It was just too early, we're just still too early in the process. One of the next questions we asked was, what do you miss most about working in the office? In this question as well, we allowed multiple answers. 71% of the respondents checked off being able to collaborate with colleagues in person. Almost 60% said easy access to my team. And also separation of work life from home life. Spontaneous meetings were picked by 40%. 1/3 said bumping into coworkers was one of the things they missed the most. And another third selected non-work related conversations with colleagues. We think an interesting follow-up question might be, would these percentages change much if we were all still working from home 3 months from now? How about 6 months from now? We suspect that these office space comforts would be missed in a similar manner, regardless of the time away. And in many ways, it boils down to your own workplace culture. Is your office space a place where your team thrives from constant social interaction, idea generation, problem solving? And how important is your day-to-day workplace culture in being a driver of both employee attraction and employee retention? Matt?
Thank you, Pete. We wanted to explore the theme of working from home, which most of us, if not all of us on this webinar right now, are probably doing. And the answers here intrigued us. When asked to comment on productivity, 28% noted an increase in productivity, which is offset by a full third suggesting that productivity has decreased. Now, these results were compiled about 10 days ago, and we do wonder if this question were to be asked again, would the results move towards noting a more increase in productivity as technology improves, the home workplace loses its temporary sense, and people adapt and become more comfortable in their new environment? This likely also reflects how organizations have adapted, or perhaps not yet fully adapted, and supported their workforce through this transitional period. We would encourage organizations to think about how your staff may be adapting to this new abnormal. We have had great success supporting many of our clients with custom and anonymous surveys that have allowed our clients to learn great insights about the sentiments of their most important resource, which is their people. We asked organizations to forecast their likelihood of working from home post-COVID-19. We were surprised to see only 1/4 anticipate mainly working remotely. It does appear that, at least for now, the vast majority are foreseeing a return to the office. We imagine, again, these responses may shift towards more adoption of working from home the longer we all work remotely. The results here cause us to wonder about a few questions. How will the office change and adapt to the impact of COVID-19 and the resulting new employee concerns and sentiments? How substantial will the shift be to the use of technology to alleviate the need for in-person meetings and gatherings, not just at home, but also in the workplace? Pete?
Okay, the next few questions we did ask a little bit about real estate and landlords. And the next question was, if you lease office space, have you asked your landlord for any rent deferrals, reductions, or even free rent? Well, 47% of the respondents said this question wasn't even applicable. So we suspect that this means roughly half own their real estate and half lease. But of the others, at least 71% said no, and only 29% said yes, they have asked their landlord for some sort of rent relief. We were a little bit surprised by this. So, why would so few nonprofits ask their landlord for a possible rent deferral? One reason might be that they assumed their landlord would not be very helpful. Okay. Another might be that their funding had not yet dropped much or at all, or they were comfortable using their own reserves. Another reason might be that they understood that any deferral simply means that they have to pay it back. So if they have the funds now, why not just keep paying while they can so they don't fall behind? Or maybe some organizations were waiting on a new government assistance program or more clarity on the existing rent relief program. For those that answered yes, we asked, has your landlord been accommodating thus far? 62% said no. Their landlord did not provide any rent relief whatsoever at the time of the survey. But 38% said yes. And of that 38%, 3/5 were given a rent deferral of 2 to 3 months. 2/5 were provided with a 1-month deferral. So, almost all of the landlords we've spoken with thus far are dealing with tenants on a case-by-case basis. Office tenants, retail tenants, whatever the case may be. And generally, we found that most landlords are helpful, but only when presented with specific information as to why rent relief is required. Without a story or clear rationale as to why support is needed, many landlords have been declining any rent deferrals, regardless of whether the tenant is a nonprofit or a for-profit. Fortunately, we have had some success in helping our clients articulate the message of why rent relief has been necessary. And we have found that the more a landlord understands their specific issues, the more receptive the landlord has actually been. Then we asked, have you consulted with your landlord about other possible ways of providing assistance? 79% said no, but 21% said yes, they had. And this is good news if your landlord has been obliging. But it could also be a bit of a timing issue since the federal government's commercial rent assistance plan was announced just before our survey launch, but its details were still very much uncertain. So, hopefully some of you have had some success with your landlord on this program. However, as many of you know, to qualify, your revenues would have had to decrease by at least 70%. So we know that this certainly is not a viable rent relief program for all tenants. Matt?
Thank you, Pete. We asked by write-in for individuals responding to provide a description of what they foresee the lasting impact of COVID-19 to be upon their sector. And what we've done is we've consolidated several consistent themes that came to us through these responses. And clearly, all you have to do is look at what we're doing right now. There's an increased focus on technology, and we expect that that will stay. Less travel and in-person meetings, not surprisingly. A change in the service delivery to reflect change in people's behaviors. Increased virtual education and interactions. We work with many organizations that provide some form of online training or training. And even before COVID-19, there was a movement towards exploring the virtual education platforms. And of course, we see that being accelerated right now. A narrowing of mandate that could reflect any number of things, be it funding or just the idea of focusing locally to avoid the idea of traveling. There's so many aspects here that could affect why one would narrow, but we saw that consistently. And then of course, increased financial strain. When asked to answer the same question with respect to operations, we saw consistently talking about new service delivery models, expansion of virtual service offering, which aligns with new service delivery models, modified work environments, how is that office space going to change? What will that look like? How are we going to accommodate our people within our four walls? It will make us better, more efficient. I must say we didn't have a lot of positive sentiment, but this is clear. Organizations are going to have to look at ways and means to maximize their ability to do what it is they do, perhaps on less resources or with less resources. Increased focus on hygiene and safety. We're all experiencing this in our personal lives, and certainly within our work communities and the communities that we serve. This will be consistent. And a reduction in our membership. We do have a lot of organizations whom we advise who are member driven. And unfortunately, we're seeing this consistently across the board.
Okay, we also asked the respondents to describe COVID's lasting impact on your workplace culture. And these are actual quotes, and they're fairly representative of the predominant themes to this question. Increased flexibility around people working from home. I think this one's pretty straightforward. I think we're going to see a lot more of this going forward, regardless of when the vaccine comes. Fewer in-person meetings. Team building and collaboration will be more important than ever. More trust will be required. A change in meeting formats and frequency. And then perhaps, probably the most telling sign of all was it's just too early to tell. We've heard this time and again, not just on the survey, from the clients we speak to all the time. And finally, the last question of our survey was simply describe COVID's lasting impact on your future emergency planning. And the first one to me says it best. Most of the quotes after this were kind of indicative and reflective of this first quote. But it's too early to do future emergency planning. We need to survive this first. But the other quotes were, we will be developing a more formal pandemic and crisis management plan. We have created a committee, right? We need to revise our fundraising plans and targets. And we like the last one as well, because lower revenue has caused our board to become more engaged and more proactive. So, certainly there are some positives that are perhaps not a ton, but there are some positives that are coming out of this. Matt?
Before we probably have time for a couple of questions, but before we go there, we wanted to provide some summary thoughts in the form of key considerations. Clearly, people are asking, will working from home become the new normal? And we suspect that question will become more clear, or the answer to that question will become more clear the longer this goes. Will there be an increased focus on technology to support an agile workforce? Will access to transit become tolerable in the absence of a vaccine, which is very interesting. I know Pete and I, in 2016, we conducted a benchmarking survey of well over 100 nonprofit organizations. And one of the themes of that survey was access. And the conclusion that we came to was the old adage of location, location, location equated to transit, transit, transit within the nonprofit community that we were working with. Is that going to be the case now? And we can tell you from personal experience and conversations we're having with organizations who we're advising right now, there's a lot of concern about alternative means of access to their premises, as people are concerned about whether or not people are going to be comfortable on transit. How will physical distancing affect the future workplace, if at all? And how long will this change last? Certainly there's the near term, but what about medium term and beyond COVID-19? How effectively are we able to adapt to the ongoing change in our environments? And perhaps most importantly, how short will our short-term memories be? With that, perhaps Pete, I know there's a question for you.
I'm taking a quick look at the questions and responses, Matt, and one person, it's not so much a question, but one person said, "I'm laughing, hysterical." So hopefully this is in reference to our earlier part of the webinar as opposed to the later part.
Pete, I can tell you that was within specific regard to your opening, which I'm glad that the audience also agreed was quite funny.
Here's a question I think we can touch on, and I'll start on this one, Matt. what do you think getting back to work will look like, and when? Okay, great question. That is a very common question for sure. We get that all the time. My personal thought is, and it's not uncommon, but I think it's definitely going to be a staggered approach, right? It's going to be in stages. I also think that the biggest challenge is not physical distancing in the office, but rather physical distancing in getting to the office and getting home. If you think about it, like at what point are you going to be comfortable taking a crowded subway, a crowded GO train, or a crowded bus? Along the same lines, how many people can safely fit in an elevator in your building? I think we're all pretty spoiled if we're in a building where we do need to take an elevator to get into our office space. I certainly don't know the metrics, but I would guess the average wait time might be 30 seconds or less. But if there's 3 or 4 people to an elevator going up or going down, I gotta think the elevator wait will be astronomical if too many people are allowed back into the office at one time, right? And certainly a lot of the focus will turn back on landlords as well. One solution to overcrowded elevators will be unlocking the stairwells. Will every landlord unlock the stairwell in their building? Is it possible, right? Because these are emergency escapes. And how many stairwells are there? If there's more than one, will some be dedicated to, going up to your workspace? Will some, and the other ones be dedicated to going down? So, great question. I think a lot of questions still need to be addressed by both local government and your landlord. But I think we're getting there. I think over the next month or so, I think we're gonna have a lot of answers to these types of questions.
So I did actually receive a question here, which I'll go ahead and address. And then Cathy, I'm not sure if following myself, if you'd like to add anything. And then I think what we'll do is we'll wrap up after Cathy, and any outstanding questions. Of course, our contact information is here. You can see our Twitter handle as well. We invite you to follow us. But I will go ahead. Somebody did reach out and ask me to elaborate on how we foresee the office environment changing, once we go back to work. Clearly, there's going to be significant change. I can tell you that we at Colliers spend a ton of time right now exploring this very question and providing all sorts of consulting services to our clients with respect to back to work programming. I'll touch upon a few things here that come to mind. Certainly things like staggered scheduling, be it arrival times to the office so that you manage things like traffic flows, both in perhaps common areas, elevators and so forth, but also to limit traffic and capacity within your own premises. Also splitting your office population into different groups, group A, group B, whatever it may be, and effectively working in shifts. This results in a few things. This does allow you to have a reduced capacity in your floor, which is going to be something that's key, but it also provides for tracking protocols. In the unfortunate circumstance where perhaps somebody is either infected or is in contact with somebody who is infected, you can track it within these groups and adjust and manage that process accordingly. Staggered seating, depending on your population, certainly in open space environments, but also in private offices, we're expecting to see where there were 2, there's likely to be 1, and perhaps it's where there were 3, there's likely to be 1 individual, depending on your per square foot allocations. Wayfinding. This is interesting within your office space, similar to what we see in retail stores, grocery stores, throughout our communities right now. You're likely to see a movement to introducing a single direction, sort of one-way routes within your office space. And this effectively unwinds a principle of design that has been a very much an underlying theme of office space over the past 10, 15 years, which is promoting the collision space. So promoting the idea that people come together within space to effectively cause people to interact and share ideas and become familiar with each other? Well, it's likely to be a movement towards unwinding that, directing people in one way and directing people away from each other. Certainly reducing the capacity in rooms like boardrooms, kitchens, meeting facilities. Also just entering your space. We're foreseeing walking into space and being greeted obviously by hand sanitizer, but then also being provided PPE, face shields, all sorts of measures to reinforce the health, safety, and well-being aspects of your office environment. And then just behaviors. Behaviors in the office are going to change. Will team meetings be in forums like this? Yes, at home, but also in the office. Is there a need to people get together literally, physically for those team meetings? Perhaps you just do it in your own personal space. There's a lot of questions here. Another piece that we would suggest to everybody, if you're on a shared floor, contact your neighbor. Make sure that you're aligned with the ideology that your neighbor has, because certainly you can do any number of things, but if your neighbor is doing something that is different, that can affect the way and mean that your people feel comfortable within your environment. And also contact your landlord. Your landlord is going to have protocols in place that they are going to expect of you, but I think it's also important to understand as a baseline what position your landlord is taking, and then you can build your own protocols from there. Cathy?
Yeah, it's such a great question. Thanks, Matt. I think it really depends what type of nonprofit you are and what kind of services you provide, because obviously it's very different if it's an office environment versus a little theater or a larger theater, like something like the Stratford Festival, a sport organization, etc. So it definitely depends on the type of organization you have. Certainly, we're going to be seeing a gradual entry back into the workforce. And I think what we're hearing is that the office workers are actually at the tail end of that. So what's most important is to get those essential workers back to work, the workers that can only work in an environment, whether it's a coffee shop or a construction site, and that the office workers will be farther down the line in terms of their re-entry back into their offices. But certainly we suspect many organizations are talking about not having their full teams in the office for a number of months, actually, not just a number of weeks, as the transition happens. Partially for two of the biggest reasons is access to childcare, or schools opening, and access to PPE. So if we don't have those two things in place, a lot of workers in our sector just simply won't be able to go back to the office, even if the office is ready for them.
It looks like we have time probably for one more question. And Cathy, I might just kind of put you on the spot here and direct us to you. I don't know if you can see it here, but the questions come in about nonprofits that lease space and schools and churches. Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough, we did speak about this, funny enough, early in the week, about the number of nonprofits that rely upon, churches as an example, whether it be childcare or other nighttime services. Do you have any comment about how they're being impacted right now? Things that you saw from your survey or anything else?
Yeah, for sure. That's a great question. So we don't have really good data about the type of landlords organizations have. We know some own their own buildings and own their assets. Some are landlords themselves in a community hub or shared space model. Many lease and rent, of course, in commercial buildings. But we don't have a good breakdown of that. That would be great to have, but that's not available at this point. We've been pre-COVID working with a partnership on doing a survey of communities around their use of faith spaces and churches in particular, and by the nonprofit sector, to try and get a handle on how many nonprofits and charities are using church spaces for Girl Guides meetings and childcares and seniors drop-in programs or exercise programs. And so that research will be released within the next month. And it shows that our sector uses those facilities, faith and church facilities, a huge amount, particularly in small and rural communities. So keeping those spaces in public hands and making sure that they continue to be there for the sector is going to be really important. And we know churches are struggling during COVID as well because they're not meeting, their congregations aren't meeting, their fundraising is down. Very similar, they are part of our charitable sector. So we're quite concerned that we won't have the public spaces, those spaces in public hands in the future. So that's certainly on our top priority list. And if you subscribe to our newsletter, which is free, you can, we'll be releasing the results of our Faith Spaces survey, I think in next month.
Great. Thanks very much, Cathy. What I think we'd like to do is let everyone go a few minutes before the hour. There's always a dog, but we tried to get a dog barking at the beginning of this in one of those clips. We couldn't quite get the technology working, but there we go. Listen, on behalf of Matt and myself, first of all, we'd like to thank all the respondents that answered our survey. As we said, over 100 respondents, which was fantastic. We'd like to thank all the respondents that responded to ONN survey. We'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. As I say, this is new to us. Hopefully there was some benefit to you. Hopefully there's a few takeaways. As Matt noted earlier, we are recording this, so we're happy to provide the video link to you afterwards. Just send us a note, send us an email, and we will happily provide you with the slides as well. And definitely thanks very much, Cathy, for taking your time. We know you're extremely busy advocating on the many thousands of nonprofits in Ontario, so thanks very much for your time today.
You're welcome.
And that's it. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a good day.